The strangest moment of Otto Fischer's war began with a piece of bread and a question he did not trust. Why would the enemy feed us like this? Mississippi, summer of 1944. The air hung thick and heavy over the prisoner camp, the kind of southern heat that pressed against the skin like a damp blanket. Even the wooden guard towers seemed to sweat under the noon sun. Rows of German prisoners stood quietly inside the fenced yard, their gray uniforms faded by months of dust and sunlight. Most of them had crossed an ocean in steel ships only weeks before, captured in North Africa or France, shipped across the Atlantic to a land they had only heard about in propaganda films. America, they had been told, was cruel to prisoners. America starved enemies. America humiliated the defeated. Otto Fischer had believed those things once. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher in Munich, a man who explained history to children and graded papers beside an open window. Now he stood in a prison camp nearly 5,000 miles from home, sweat rolling slowly down the back of his neck, watching a military truck rumble through the gate. The engine cut off with a rough cough. For a moment, nothing happened. Guards stood in the shade. Prisoners waited in silence. Then the smell arrived. It drifted across the yard like something unreal. Warm bread, grilled meat, a sharp scent of mustard carried by the breeze. Otto frowned slightly. Around him, other prisoners lifted their heads. The smell did not belong to prison camps. It did not belong to war. It belonged to summer festivals, to street vendors in peaceful cities, to a life that no longer seemed possible. The back of the truck opened with a metallic clatter. A young American soldier climbed down, sleeves rolled above his elbows. His name patch read Whitaker. He could not have been older than 22. Oklahoma-born, though none of the prisoners knew that yet. He moved without hurry, lifting a metal container from the truck bed. Steam escaped when he opened the lid. The smell grew stronger. Some of the prisoners exchanged quiet glances. Suspicion moved through the group like a ripple across water. Food offered by an enemy could mean many things. Otto folded his arms and watched carefully. Whitaker walked down the line, placing something into each prisoner's hands. A long bun. Soft white bread. Inside it rested a thin sausage, dark and freshly grilled. A line of yellow mustard ran across the top, like paint across a canvas. Otto looked down at the object now resting in his own hands. He had never seen anything quite like it. Not a sausage the German way. Not a sandwich either. Something else entirely. Around him, dozens of prisoners held identical pieces of food, yet none of them took a bite. The yard became strangely quiet. A few men whispered under their breath. Perhaps it was a trick. Perhaps a test. Otto studied the young soldier again. Whitaker noticed the hesitation. He paused, reached into the container, took one of the same buns, and bit into it without a word. Bread compressed softly between his fingers. He chewed slowly, swallowed, then continued down the line. No speeches, no orders, just a simple gesture under the wide Mississippi sky. Otto stared at the hot dog in his hands while the smell of warm bread rose into the humid air, and for the first time since the war had taken everything familiar from his life, he felt something unexpected begin to replace the quiet certainty he once carried about his enemies. Otto continued to hold the warm bun in both hands, as if it might disappear if he moved too quickly. Around him the yard remained quiet, the kind of silence that forms when dozens of men are thinking the same thought, but none of them are ready to say it out loud. The smell alone was enough to stir memories that had nothing to do with prison camps or guard towers or long ocean crossings. It reminded Otto of summer evenings in Munich before the war, when street vendors sold sausages near the train station, and the air carried the soft noise of people talking and laughing. For a moment the memory felt so clear that he almost expected to hear the bells of a tram rolling down the street. Instead, there was only the distant buzz of cicadas in the Mississippi heat and the low murmur of prisoners whispering in German. A man beside Otto leaned closer and spoke quietly. Maybe it is spoiled. Maybe they want to see which of us eats first. Otto did not answer right away. He studied the bread again. The bun looked fresh, pale, and soft, nothing like the coarse loaves people had grown used to in Germany during the later years of the war. The sausage inside it glistened slightly in the sunlight. A thin stripe of mustard ran across the top, bright yellow against the dark meat. It looked simple, honest, but Otto had learned during the war that appearances could not always be trusted. Across the yard, another prisoner finally lifted his food closer to his face, smelling it cautiously. No one stopped him. No guard shouted. The American soldier named Whitaker had already moved farther down the line, handing out more hot dogs with the same calm rhythm, one after another, as if he were working at a summer fair instead of a prisoner camp. Otto watched him carefully. The soldier did not stare at the prisoners with suspicion. He did not rush them. He simply walked along the line, giving every man the same meal. Nothing more. Nothing less. Otto realized something strange then. The young soldier had eaten the exact same food without hesitation. Not to prove a point with words. Just a small action that required no translation. Bread compressed in his hand. One bite. A swallow. Then he kept walking. Otto looked again at the hot dog resting in his hands. The heat from the bread had already begun to fade slightly in the thick air. If he waited too long, it would become cold. Another prisoner several steps away finally took the smallest bite possible, barely more than testing the edge of the bread. The man froze for a second, chewing slowly. Nothing happened. No reaction from the guards. No sudden illness. After a moment, he took a second bite, larger this time. Otto heard him whisper something under his breath that sounded almost like surprise. A few other prisoners noticed and began watching him closely. Otto lifted the hot dog toward his mouth. The smell grew stronger, a mixture of warm bread and grilled meat that seemed almost impossible after months of rationed food and endless uncertainty. He hesitated only for a second more before taking a careful bite. The bread was softer than anything he had tasted in a long time. The sausage inside was warm and slightly smoky. The mustard added a sharp brightness that spread across his tongue in a way that made him blink in surprise. Otto stopped chewing for a moment, as if his mind needed time to catch up with what his senses had already discovered. It was not just food. It was good food. Simple, but satisfying in a way that reminded him of ordinary life before the war had reshaped everything. Around him, the silence began to change. One prisoner after another took their first bite. Some did it cautiously, others with sudden hunger. Within a minute, the quiet yard filled with the soft sound of men chewing bread and meat under the wide Mississippi sky. No one spoke loudly. There was something almost respectful about the moment, as if everyone understood that they were experiencing something unexpected together. Otto glanced up across the yard and saw Whitaker standing beside the truck again, watching the prisoners eat with a neutral expression that revealed nothing about what he might be thinking. Their eyes met for a brief second across the distance. Whitaker gave a small nod, almost casual, before turning to lift another container from the back of the truck. Otto looked down at the half-eaten hot dog in his hands. For months, he had believed that every action from the enemy must carry hidden cruelty or deception. Yet here he stood in a prison camp in Mississippi, eating warm bread and sausage under the open sky, while cicadas hummed in the trees beyond the fence. The thought settled slowly in his mind, quiet but undeniable. Perhaps the world was more complicated than the stories he had once believed. The first hot dog disappeared faster than Otto expected. Hunger had a way of making decisions simple once the mind stopped arguing with itself. Within minutes, only crumbs of soft bread remained in his hand, and a faint trace of mustard lingered on his fingers. Around him, the same transformation had happened across the entire yard. Men who had once stared suspiciously at the unfamiliar food were now finishing the last bites quietly, some even turning the empty paper wrappers over in their hands, as if they might somehow produce another meal from them. The Mississippi sun still hung high in the sky, bright and unforgiving, but something about the moment felt different now. The tension that had hovered in the air when the truck first arrived had softened. It had not disappeared completely, but it had changed into something quieter, something thoughtful. Otto wiped his hands slowly against the side of his uniform trousers and looked across the camp again. The fences were still there. The watchtowers were still there. Guards still moved along the perimeter at a steady pace. Yet the yard did not feel the same as it had an hour earlier. A few prisoners began speaking again in low voices. One man behind Otto laughed softly in disbelief. Another shook his head as if he had just witnessed something that made no sense at all. Otto heard someone say that in Germany people would stand in line for hours for a piece of bread half that size. Another voice answered that even soldiers at the front rarely tasted meat like that anymore. These were quiet conversations, almost reflective, as if each man was measuring the experience against the stories he had once believed. Otto felt the same quiet calculation happening in his own mind. For years he had listened to speeches, broadcasts, and confident explanations about what the world outside Germany looked like. The enemy had been described with absolute certainty. The enemy was cruel. The enemy was corrupt. The enemy despised them. Yet here in the middle of Mississippi, a young soldier had handed out warm food without a single harsh word. Otto could not easily fit that reality into the old picture that had once seemed so clear. A metal lid clanged again near the truck. Otto looked up and saw Whitaker lifting another container down from the bed of the vehicle. The soldier moved with the same calm rhythm as before, carrying the container toward a long wooden table near the fence. One of the guards joined him, helping arrange stacks of paper cups beside the container. A few moments later, the guard dipped a ladle inside and began filling the cups. The liquid inside was pale and cloudy with small pieces of ice floating near the surface. The sight alone was enough to catch the attention of every prisoner nearby. Ice was not something most of them had seen in a long time. In Germany during the final years of the war, even clean drinking water had sometimes been difficult to find. Otto stepped forward slowly with the others as the line formed again. The paper cup felt cool in his hand, condensation already gathering on the outside in the humid air. He lifted it cautiously and tasted the drink. It was lemonade, slightly sweet, slightly sour, cold enough to send a small shiver through him despite the 90-degree heat. For a moment Otto closed his eyes. The flavor was simple, but it carried the unmistakable taste of summer. Around him several prisoners laughed quietly in surprise after their first sip. The reactions were small, but genuine. No one seemed to know exactly how to respond to such ordinary generosity in such an unexpected place. Otto lowered the empty cup and looked across the yard again. Whitaker had stepped back toward the truck, leaning casually against the metal side while the prisoners finished their drinks. He appeared relaxed, almost as if the entire scene was routine. Otto studied the young soldier carefully, noticing details he had ignored earlier. The sleeves rolled neatly above his forearms. The faint dust on his boots from the gravel road outside the camp. The expression of someone simply doing his assigned task without any desire for attention or praise. Otto realized that the moment had not been dramatic at all. No speeches, no declarations, just bread, meat, and a cup of cold lemonade shared under a wide American sky. Yet something about the simplicity of it carried more weight than Otto expected. As the prisoners slowly returned their empty cups and drifted back toward the shade of the barracks, Otto felt a quiet thought settle deeper in his mind. Sometimes the smallest experiences could challenge the largest beliefs, and sometimes it only took one unexpected meal in a distant place to begin seeing the world in a different way. The afternoon sun slowly drifted westward above the Mississippi camp, but the heat did not fade with it. It simply settled deeper into the wooden barracks, into the gravel paths, into the long stretches of wire fence that shimmered slightly in the distance. Otto Fischer sat on the narrow wooden step outside his barracks and watched the yard with the quiet attention that had become a habit during captivity. Life inside the camp moved in steady rhythms. Guards changed positions in the towers. Prisoners carried buckets of water from one building to another. A few men sat beneath the thin shade of a pine tree speaking softly in German about places that now felt very far away. Yet Otto could not stop thinking about the simple meal from earlier that day. Bread, sausage, mustard, lemonade. None of it had been extraordinary by American standards, he imagined. Yet to the prisoners it had carried a weight that reached far beyond the taste of food. It had felt like a reminder of something most of them had not experienced in a long time. Ordinary life. Otto rubbed his fingers together absent-mindedly, as if he could still feel the warmth of the bun resting in his hands. A shadow stretched across the gravel path, and Otto looked up. The young American soldier, named Whitaker, was walking slowly past the barracks, carrying an empty metal container back toward the truck. The soldier moved at an easy pace, boots crunching lightly against the gravel. Up close, he looked even younger than Otto first believed, perhaps no more than 22 years old. A few strands of light brown hair had escaped beneath his cap, and the sleeves of his uniform were still rolled neatly above his elbows. He paused near the truck and set the container inside the bed before wiping his hands with a small cloth. For a moment, he simply stood there looking across the yard as if checking that everything was in order. Otto noticed something then that surprised him. Whitaker was not watching the prisoners with suspicion. His eyes moved calmly across the yard, the way a farmer might glance over a field at the end of the day. Otto realized that the young soldier did not look like someone guarding enemies. He looked like someone finishing a job before heading home for supper. Otto stood up slowly and walked a few steps closer to the fence line, careful not to approach too near. The distance between prisoner and guard remained an unspoken boundary that everyone understood. Whitaker noticed the movement and glanced toward Otto. For a moment, the two men simply regarded each other across the open yard. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Otto nodded once in quiet acknowledgement. Whitaker returned the gesture with a small nod of his own, almost casual, as if two strangers had passed each other on a sidewalk in a quiet American town. Then Whitaker turned slightly and lifted a metal canteen from the truck, taking a long drink before placing it back on the seat. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but it left Otto with a strange feeling that he could not easily explain. During the war, he had imagined the enemy as something distant and frightening, a faceless force somewhere beyond the horizon. Yet the man standing beside the truck did not resemble any of those images. He looked like a young mechanic or farmhand who might have stood beside Otto in line at a bakery years ago if the world had followed a different path. Otto returned to the wooden step outside the barracks and sat down again. The camp had grown quieter now as the late afternoon light softened across the yard. Somewhere beyond the fence, a truck passed along the road, its engine humming steadily as it disappeared into the distance. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of pine trees from the edge of the property. Otto leaned his elbows on his knees and looked out across the wide southern sky. It stretched endlessly above the camp, bright blue fading slowly toward the pale colors of early evening. For the first time since arriving in America, he felt something unusual settle in his thoughts. Curiosity, not about the camp itself, but about the people beyond the fence. What kind of country could feed prisoners like that and treat the moment as something ordinary rather than remarkable? Otto did not have an answer yet, but he suspected the question itself might matter more than the certainty he once carried. And as the sun lowered toward the horizon, Otto realized that the world he thought he understood had begun to quietly shift with nothing more dramatic than a warm meal shared beneath an open sky. Evening arrived slowly over the Mississippi camp, not with a sudden change, but with a gradual softening of the light. The sharp, white glare of the afternoon sun faded into long golden shadows that stretched across the gravel yard and the wooden barracks. Otto Fisher remained seated outside the doorway for a long time, watching the day settle into quiet routine. The air was still warm, perhaps 85 degrees even as the sun lowered, but the thick pressure of the afternoon heat had begun to loosen its grip. A breeze moved gently through the tall pine trees beyond the fence, carrying the scent of resin and dry grass into the camp. For the first time that day, the yard felt almost calm. Several prisoners sat nearby speaking softly about their homes. One man described the hills outside Stuttgart, where he used to hike on Sunday mornings. Another talked about the smell of fresh bread from a bakery on a narrow street in Hamburg. These conversations had become a kind of evening ritual, a way to keep memory alive in a place where every day looked nearly the same. Otto listened without speaking. His thoughts remained somewhere else entirely. The image of the warm bread and sausage from earlier still lingered in his mind with surprising clarity. Not just the taste, but the moment itself. The hesitation, the quiet suspicion, the unexpected simplicity of it all. He wondered how many other small moments like that existed in the country beyond the fence. A faint metallic sound came from the far side of the yard. Otto glanced up and saw Whitaker again near the truck, finishing the last of his work before sunset. The young soldier lifted a wooden crate from the back of the vehicle and carried it toward a small storage shed beside the administration building. His movements were unhurried, almost relaxed. When he returned to the truck, he paused for a moment and stretched his shoulders as if the long day had finally caught up with him. Otto noticed the small details again. The dust along the edges of the soldier's boots, the faded stitching on the sleeve of his uniform, the easy posture of someone accustomed to long days outdoors. It reminded Otto of the farmers he had known as a boy in Bavaria, men who measured time not by clocks but by the movement of the sun across the sky. A guard nearby called out something in English that Otto could not fully understand. Whitaker answered with a short response and then closed the back of the truck with a firm metallic click. The sound echoed briefly across the quiet yard before fading into the evening air. Otto realized something then that he had not considered before. For Whitaker, this moment was likely nothing special at all. Just another day of routine work at a prisoner camp somewhere in the American South. Handing out food, cleaning equipment, waiting for the end of his shift. The thought carried a strange kind of weight. To the prisoners, the meal earlier had felt almost symbolic, a moment that challenged years of belief and expectation. But to the young soldier it had probably been as ordinary as delivering mail or filling a water barrel. Otto leaned back against the rough wooden wall of the barracks and looked toward the horizon beyond the fence. The sky had begun to shift into deeper shades of orange and pale violet as the sun moved closer to the tree-line. Somewhere in the distance a train whistle echoed faintly through the countryside, long and low, reminding him that life outside the camp continued along its own path. People were finishing work. Families were preparing dinner. Children were likely running through yards that stretched beneath the same wide sky. Otto tried to imagine those ordinary scenes and found that it no longer felt impossible to picture them. The thought would have surprised him only weeks earlier during the long ocean crossing when America had seemed like a distant and hostile place. Now the country felt different. Not familiar yet, but no longer entirely unknown. A group of prisoners nearby stood and began walking toward the barracks as the guards called for evening roll. Otto rose slowly and brushed the dust from his trousers before joining them. As he walked across the yard, he glanced once more toward the truck near the gate. Whitaker had already climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The vehicle rumbled to life and rolled slowly toward the road outside the camp. For a brief moment the soldier looked back across the yard, his gaze passing over the rows of barracks and the quiet figures of the prisoners preparing for the night. Then the truck turned onto the gravel road and disappeared beyond the fence line. Otto stood still for a second longer than necessary, watching the empty road where the truck had vanished. A simple meal had come and gone with the afternoon sun, yet the quiet change it left behind remained. And as the last light of the day settled over the camp, Otto understood that sometimes the beginning of a new understanding did not arrive with loud declarations or dramatic events. Sometimes it arrived quietly, carried in the warmth of bread, the taste of mustard, and the unexpected realization that the world beyond the fence might not be what he once believed. Morning came early in the Mississippi camp, announced not by an alarm but by the slow brightening of the sky beyond the pine trees. Otto Fisher woke before the guards called roll, as he often did. The air inside the barracks was cooler than the afternoon before, perhaps 72 degrees, carrying the quiet freshness that existed only in the first hour of daylight. Thin lines of sunlight slipped through the wooden slats of the wall and stretched across the floorboards where rows of simple bunks stood in silence. For a few moments Otto remained lying still, listening. Outside he could hear the distant call of birds and the low murmur of wind moving through the trees beyond the fence. Somewhere farther away a truck engine started along the country road, its sound fading slowly across the open fields. It was a peaceful kind of morning, the sort of morning Otto remembered from his childhood before the war had rearranged the shape of the world. He sat up slowly and swung his feet onto the wooden floor. Around him other prisoners were beginning to wake, moving quietly through the narrow space as they folded blankets and prepared for the day. No one spoke loudly. Morning inside the camp usually began in quiet routine. Otto stepped outside the barracks and felt the cool gravel beneath his boots. The sky above the camp had turned pale blue, and the rising sun cast long golden beams across the yard. The fences and watchtowers still stood exactly where they had the night before, yet the camp felt strangely different after the events of the previous afternoon. Otto could not fully explain why. Perhaps it was because the memory of that small moment with the warm bread had followed him into the new day. He walked slowly across the yard with the others as the guards organized the morning count. Men stood in loose lines, shoulders relaxed, eyes still adjusting to the brightening light. The smell of coffee drifted faintly from the administration building near the gate. Otto noticed that several prisoners glanced in that direction with quiet curiosity. The smell alone carried a sense of normal life that felt almost unfamiliar. After the roll call finished, the yard slowly returned to motion. Some prisoners moved toward the work sheds while others gathered near the water barrels along the fence. Otto stood near the center of the yard for a moment. watching the sunlight climb higher over the camp. Then he heard the sound of an engine approaching from the gravel road outside the gate. It was the same steady rumble he had heard the evening before. Heads turned across the yard as the truck rolled into view through the entrance. Dust followed behind its tires as it passed beneath the wooden guard post and entered the camp. Otto recognized the vehicle immediately. The same military truck. The same dull green paint faded by the southern sun. And behind the wheel sat the same young soldier. Whitaker guided the truck toward its usual spot beside the storage shed and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet after the motor stopped seemed to spread across the yard like a pause in conversation. The soldier stepped down from the cab and stretched his arms briefly before moving toward the back of the vehicle. Otto noticed the familiar metal containers stacked inside the truck bed. For a moment the yard grew still again, not from fear this time, but from a quiet kind of expectation. No one spoke about it directly, yet many of the prisoners watched with careful interest. Whitaker lifted one of the containers and carried it toward the long wooden table near the fence, exactly as he had done the day before. The movements were the same. Calm, efficient, ordinary. Otto felt a small shift in his thoughts as he watched. Yesterday the food had arrived as a surprise that challenged everything he believed. Today the moment felt different. Not because the uncertainty had vanished completely, but because something inside him had changed overnight. He no longer expected cruelty in every small action. The realization came quietly, like the slow warming of the air after sunrise. Whitaker set the container on the table and opened the lid. Steam rose gently into the morning light. Otto could not yet see what food waited inside, but the smell alone began drifting across the yard again, warm and inviting against the fresh morning air. Around him a few prisoners exchanged curious glances. Otto folded his arms and watched the scene carefully, the same way he had the day before. Yet this time his thoughts carried a different tone. Not suspicion, something closer to patience. As the young soldier prepared the table and the morning sunlight spread across the camp, Otto realized that sometimes understanding did not arrive in a single moment. Sometimes it grew quietly from one small experience to the next, like light slowly filling a room at the start of a new day. The morning light continued to spread slowly across the Mississippi camp, warming the gravel yard and the wooden walls of the barracks. Otto Fisher stood among the other prisoners watching the thin column of steam rise from the metal container Whitaker had just opened. The smell reached them a few seconds later, carried gently through the cool morning air. It was different from the day before. Not the smoky scent of grilled sausage. This time it carried the soft, familiar aroma of warm bread again, but sweeter somehow. Something baked. Something comforting. The scent alone caused several men to glance toward each other with quiet curiosity. Otto folded his arms and watched the young soldier carefully. Whitaker moved with the same calm routine as always, lifting a stack of small paper trays from the back of the truck and placing them neatly along the wooden table. A guard stepped beside him, helping arrange the trays in a straight line. No announcements were made. No explanation was offered. Yet the message was clear enough. Food again. A few prisoners began walking toward the table in slow, cautious steps, though the tension that had existed the day before was noticeably absent. Curiosity had replaced suspicion. Otto waited a moment longer before joining the quiet line forming across the yard. The gravel crunched softly under their boots as they moved forward one by one. When Otto reached the table, he could finally see what rested inside the container. Small round pastries, golden brown on the outside. Light sugar dusted across the top like fresh snow. The sight alone made Otto pause. He had not seen anything like that since the early years of the war, when bakeries still filled the streets of Munich with the smell of fresh dough. Whitaker lifted one of the pastries with a pair of metal tongs and placed it carefully on Otto's paper tray. The pastry was still warm, soft enough that Otto could see faint steam rising from the small split along its surface. Whitaker then set a paper cup beside it and filled the cup from a metal pot sitting near the edge of the table. Dark liquid. Coffee. Real coffee by the smell of it. Otto looked down at the tray in his hands for a moment before stepping aside to let the next man forward. Around him other prisoners examined their trays with the same quiet disbelief. The pastry felt almost weightless in his hand, yet its warmth seemed to carry a sense of comfort that was difficult to explain. Otto lifted the cup first. The coffee was strong and slightly bitter, exactly the way he remembered it from mornings long ago. He took a small sip and felt the warmth spread slowly through his chest. For a moment, he simply stood there holding the cup, allowing the taste to settle. Then he looked down at the pastry and carefully broke it in half. The inside was pale and soft, a simple sweet dough that carried the faint scent of vanilla. Otto tasted it slowly. Sugar. Warm bread. A flavor so ordinary that it felt almost unbelievable in the middle of a prisoner camp. Nearby, a prisoner laughed quietly in surprise after his first bite. Another man shook his head and whispered something in German that sounded like a memory returning. Otto watched the reactions around him and noticed how different the mood felt compared to the previous morning. The uncertainty was gone now. In its place, there was something quieter, something reflective. The prisoners were no longer staring at the food as if it were a test. They were simply eating. Across the yard, Whitaker leaned lightly against the side of the truck, watching the line move forward as each man received the same small tray. His expression remained neutral, almost thoughtful, as though he were observing a routine he had seen many times before. Otto studied the soldier again while finishing the last piece of pastry. The moment felt strangely ordinary now. Coffee in the morning, bread in hand, the soft sounds of men speaking quietly beneath a bright southern sky. It reminded Otto of mornings from another life, before the war had drawn invisible lines across the world. A breeze moved through the yard and carried the scent of pine trees once again across the camp. Otto finished the last sip of coffee and looked down at the empty tray. The simple meal had lasted only a few minutes, yet it had changed the rhythm of the morning in a way that no one could easily deny. As the prisoners slowly returned their trays and stepped back from the table, Otto realized that the distance between two worlds had grown slightly smaller again. Not through speeches, not through orders, just through the quiet language of bread, sugar, and coffee shared in the early light of a Mississippi morning. The warmth of the coffee lingered long after the last cup had been emptied and returned to the table. The morning had grown brighter now, sunlight spilling across the yard and reflecting faintly off the strands of wire along the fence. Otto Fischer stood with several other prisoners near the water barrels, holding the quiet memory of the sweet pastry and the strong coffee that had begun the day. The taste still rested gently on his tongue, a simple flavor that somehow carried more meaning than he expected. Around him, the camp had begun to move into its usual rhythm. Men were assigned to small work groups. Buckets were lifted. Tools were carried from one shed to another. Yet there was something lighter in the air than there had been before. The conversations among the prisoners had changed. No one spoke loudly, but the tone had shifted from guarded caution to quiet curiosity. One man described the pastry with careful detail, as if explaining it might somehow make sense of the experience. Another laughed softly and said he had not tasted real coffee since the winter of 1942. Otto listened, but did not join the conversation immediately. His eyes drifted across the yard toward the truck again. Whitaker was still there, moving slowly through the last steps of his routine. The young soldier gathered the empty trays and stacked them neatly into a crate before carrying the crate back to the vehicle. His movements were steady and deliberate, the actions of someone who had performed the same task many times. Yet Otto noticed something new this morning. The soldier seemed aware of the quiet attention surrounding him, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the calm understanding that the moment mattered more to the prisoners than it did to him. When Whitaker turned toward the truck again, Otto stepped a little closer to the fence line without thinking. The distance between them remained several yards, but it felt smaller now than it had the day before. Whitaker paused near the truck door and glanced toward the yard. For a brief second, their eyes met again. This time, Otto spoke a single word in careful English. "Thank you." The word felt unfamiliar in his mouth after months of silence between prisoner and guard. Whitaker did not appear surprised. He simply nodded once, the same small gesture he had given before. There was no dramatic reaction. No long conversation followed. The exchange lasted only a moment before the soldier turned back to the truck and placed the crate inside the bed. Yet the simplicity of the moment carried its own quiet weight. Otto stepped back from the fence and returned to the water barrel, dipping a small metal cup into the cool water. As he drank, he thought about the strange path that had brought him here. A teacher from Munich, now standing in a prisoner camp thousands of miles away, learning unexpected lessons about the world through food and silence rather than through books or lectures. A breeze moved again through the pine trees outside the fence, sending soft shadows across the gravel yard. Otto leaned against the wooden post beside the barrel and watched the morning unfold. The work crews began moving toward the storage sheds. A guard checked a clipboard near the administration building. The routine of the camp continued exactly as it had every other day. Yet Otto felt something inside him had quietly shifted again. The war had drawn sharp lines between people, enemy and ally, us and them. Those lines had once seemed permanent and unchangeable. But standing there in the warm Mississippi sunlight, Otto realized that reality was often more complicated than the simple maps drawn during wartime speeches. Whitaker climbed into the truck and started the engine once more. The sound rumbled softly through the yard as the vehicle rolled toward the gate. Several prisoners watched it leave with thoughtful expressions. The truck passed beneath the guard post and turned onto the gravel road beyond the fence. Dust lifted behind its tires as it disappeared between the pine trees. Otto remained where he stood for a moment longer, listening to the fading sound of the engine. He realized then that what mattered was not the food itself, but the quiet reminder hidden within it. Even in the middle of a war that stretched across continents, ordinary gestures still had the power to cross invisible boundaries. And sometimes the most powerful moments arrived not through loud declarations, but through the simple act of sharing bread and coffee beneath an open sky. The rest of the morning unfolded under a bright Mississippi sky that seemed to stretch endlessly above the camp. By late morning, the temperature had climbed past 88 degrees, and the gravel yard shimmered slightly beneath the sun. Otto Fisher worked with a small group of prisoners near the storage shed, carrying wooden crates from one stack to another. The work itself was simple. Lift, walk 20 feet, set the crate down, repeat. It was the kind of task that allowed the mind to wander while the body moved automatically. And Otto's thoughts wandered often now, not toward the past the way they had during the first weeks of captivity, but toward the strange new questions that had begun forming in his mind. The memory of the previous day's hot dog and the morning pastry still lingered with surprising clarity. Not because the food had been extraordinary, but because of the quiet message hidden inside it. War had taught him to expect cruelty from the enemy. Yet the small routines of this camp suggested something different. As Otto carried another crate across the yard, he glanced toward the distant road beyond the fence. The truck had been gone for several hours now. Whitaker was likely somewhere down that road, perhaps returning to a nearby town or supply depot. Otto tried to imagine the world outside the camp gates. A town with grocery stores, families sitting at kitchen tables, children riding bicycles along dusty streets beneath the same wide sky. It was a strange thought, realizing that ordinary life continued so close to the place where prisoners waited out the war. A guard nearby called out a short instruction, and the work group paused for a moment to drink water from a large metal barrel. Otto dipped his cup into the cool water and took a long drink. The liquid tasted clean and refreshing against the heat of the late morning air. As he lowered the cup, he noticed another prisoner watching him with a thoughtful expression. The man's name was Lucas Weber, a former railway mechanic from Cologne who had arrived at the camp several weeks earlier. Lucas spoke quietly in German. "Do you think they do this every day?" Otto understood the question immediately. The food, the coffee, the pastries. He shrugged slightly before answering. "I do not know yet, but it does not feel like a performance." Lucas nodded slowly. "I thought the same thing. If they wanted to impress us, they would say something about it." Otto glanced across the yard again. The camp looked almost peaceful in the bright sunlight. Guards walked their usual paths along the fence line. The watchtower shadows moved slowly across the gravel as the sun climbed higher. Nothing about the scene suggested that the moment with the food had been planned as some kind of display. It had felt too ordinary for that. Otto returned his cup to the barrel and lifted another crate with Lucas. As they carried it toward the stack near the shed, Lucas spoke again. "Back home, my father owned a small bakery." Otto raised an eyebrow slightly. Lucas continued with a faint smile. "Every morning at 5 o'clock, he would wake up and start baking bread. The smell filled the whole street. When I tasted that pastry this morning, for a moment I thought I was standing in front of his shop again." Otto felt a quiet understanding pass between them. Food had a strange power to awaken memory. The taste of bread, the smell of coffee, small details that could carry a person across years and across continents. They set the crate down and wiped their hands against their trousers before returning for the next one. As the work continued, Otto noticed something else that had changed inside the camp. The prisoners were beginning to speak more openly about their observations. Not loudly, not recklessly, but the careful wall of silence that had existed during the first weeks of captivity was slowly beginning to loosen. Men compared small experiences. The way the guard spoke, the way the camp routine functioned, the unexpected kindness hidden inside ordinary moments. Otto realized that the transformation was happening gradually, almost invisibly, like the slow turning of seasons. The war had built strong beliefs inside each of them. Yet now those beliefs were being quietly tested by everyday reality. The sun moved toward noon, and the heat climbed past 90 degrees. The work group finished stacking the last crate and stepped back to rest beneath the thin shade of the shed roof. Otto wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked once more toward the road beyond the fence. Somewhere out there, Whitaker was continuing his day just like any other soldier assigned to supply duty. To the young American, the morning coffee and pastry had likely been nothing more than routine. Yet inside the camp, those small gestures had begun to change something much larger. Otto leaned back against the wooden wall and watched the horizon shimmer in the heat. The war was still far from over. The fences were still standing. But for the first time since his capture, he began to wonder if the world waiting beyond those fences might be more complicated and perhaps more human than he had ever imagined. By early afternoon, the Mississippi heat had settled over the camp like a heavy blanket, pushing the temperature past 92 degrees and turning the gravel yard into a field of bright, white glare. Otto Fisher stood with the other prisoners beneath the narrow strip of shade beside the storage shed, grateful for the small relief the wooden roof provided. The morning work had finished, and the camp had entered the slower rhythm that often followed the midday meal. Some men sat quietly on the ground with their backs against the wall. Others spoke softly in pairs, sharing small fragments of memory from home as if they were passing around pieces of another life. Otto listened for a while, but his attention kept drifting toward the long road beyond the fence. The road curved through a stretch of pine trees before disappearing into the rolling farmland beyond the camp. From where he stood, he could see only a narrow strip of the world outside. Yet that strip had begun to feel more real with each passing day. The war had once made everything beyond Germany seem distant and abstract. Now that distance had shrunk to the width of a gravel road. Lucas Weber sat beside Otto, wiping his forehead with a small cloth as the heat continued to rise. He glanced toward the road as well before speaking quietly in German. "Do you think you will return again tomorrow?" Otto knew immediately who Lucas meant. The young American soldier with the supply truck had already become a quiet topic of conversation among the prisoners. Otto shrugged slowly before answering. "It seems likely. This camp must receive supplies every day." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose you are right." For a moment, neither man spoke. The sound of cicadas filled the air beyond the fence, their steady rhythm blending with the distant hum of wind moving through the trees. Otto leaned his shoulders against the rough wooden wall and closed his eyes briefly, letting the warm air settle around him. The camp felt strangely peaceful at that moment. Not free, certainly not home, but calmer than he had ever imagined a prisoner camp could be. When he opened his eyes again, he noticed a guard walking slowly across the yard carrying a clipboard. The guard stopped near the work shed and checked something on the paper before moving on without a word. The routine continued exactly as it always had. Yet Otto could not shake the quiet sense that something inside the camp had begun to change. The small moments from the past 2 days had created a different atmosphere among the prisoners. Suspicion had given way to cautious observation. The men were no longer expecting the worst in every interaction. Instead, they were watching carefully, learning the patterns of this unfamiliar place. Lucas shifted slightly beside him and spoke again. "Back in Cologne, my father always said something interesting about bread." Otto glanced toward him. Lucas smiled faintly before continuing. "He said that when people share bread together, even strangers stop being strangers for a moment." Otto considered that thought carefully. It sounded simple, almost like something a teacher might say to a classroom of children. Yet standing there in the Mississippi heat, Otto realized how true it felt. A few small meals had begun to dissolve the invisible wall that war had built in his mind. The men beyond the fence were no longer abstract enemies. They were individuals with routines, responsibilities, and ordinary habits. A breeze moved through the pine trees again, stirring the dry needles along the ground outside the camp. Otto watched the branches sway gently against the bright sky. Somewhere far beyond those trees the world continued with its usual rhythm. Farmers working fields, families preparing dinners, trains moving along tracks that stretched across the countryside. For a moment Otto allowed himself to imagine walking along that road, without fences beside it. The thought felt distant, but not impossible. The war would eventually end. That much he knew. And when it did, the memory of this place would follow him home in ways he could not yet predict. He would remember the heat of the southern summer, the quiet routine of the camp, and the strange realization that understanding sometimes begins with the smallest gestures. Otto opened his eyes fully and looked once more toward the empty road. The afternoon sunlight shimmered across the gravel surface, stretching into the distance like a path waiting to be followed. The young soldier with the truck would likely return again tomorrow, and when he did, the quiet lesson that had begun with a simple meal would continue to grow, one ordinary moment at a time, beneath the wide Mississippi sky. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, and the intense Mississippi heat finally began to loosen its grip on the camp. The temperature dropped slightly below 90 degrees as long shadows stretched across the gravel yard. Otto Fischer sat once again on the wooden step outside the barracks, watching the lights soften across the rows of buildings. The sky above the pine trees had begun turning pale gold, the kind of color that appeared only in the final hour before sunset. Around him the camp moved through its familiar evening routine. A few prisoners washed their hands at the water barrels. Others sat quietly, speaking in low voices about places that existed far beyond the fences. The rhythm of the camp was predictable now, almost peaceful in its repetition. Yet Otto knew that something subtle had changed within these routines over the past 2 days. The men spoke differently now. Their voices carried less bitterness and more reflection. It was not that the war had disappeared or that the fences had lost their meaning, but the certainty that once filled their thoughts had begun to soften. Otto leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees and looked toward the distant road again. The gravel path beyond the gate glowed faintly in the evening light, winding between the tall pine trees like a quiet ribbon leading into the wider world. He wondered briefly where that road might lead. Perhaps to a small town with wooden storefronts and quiet streets. Perhaps to farms where families gathered around dinner tables while the sun set across wide fields. The thought felt strangely close now. Not real yet, but no longer impossible to imagine. Footsteps approached across the gravel, and Otto glanced up to see Lucas Weber walking toward him. Lucas lowered himself onto the step beside Otto with a tired sigh, wiping his forehead with the same small cloth he carried each day. For a moment neither man spoke. The silence between them felt comfortable, the kind that existed between people who had already shared enough words earlier. Finally Lucas looked toward the road and said quietly in German, "Tomorrow morning we will see if it happens again." Otto nodded slowly. "Yes, we will." Lucas smiled faintly, then leaned back against the wooden wall. "It is strange," he said after a moment. "When we first arrived here, I thought every day would feel exactly the same." Otto understood the thought. Prison camps had a way of flattening time, turning days into identical copies of each other. Yet something about the past 2 days had broken that pattern. Not with drama or conflict, but with small moments that carried unexpected meaning. Otto looked down at his hands resting on his knees. The rough wood beneath his fingers reminded him of the classroom desk where he once graded papers back in Munich. He had spent years explaining history to young students, describing the movements of nations and the decisions of leaders. Yet none of those lessons had ever mentioned moments like these. Moments when ordinary people quietly challenged the stories they had been told about each other. A distant train whistle echoed again across the countryside, long and low against the evening sky. Otto lifted his head slightly, listening as the sound faded into the distance. Trains meant travel, movement, connection between places. The world beyond the fences was still moving forward, even while the war held millions of people in strange and unexpected places. The light continued to fade as the sun lowered behind the trees. A guard called out instructions near the administration building, and several prisoners began moving toward the barracks for evening count. Otto stood slowly and brushed the dust from his trousers before turning toward the doorway. Lucas stood beside him and stretched his shoulders before walking back toward his bunk. Otto paused for one final glance at the road beyond the gate. The gravel surface now glowed softly under the fading light, almost silver against the darkening trees. Somewhere beyond that road Whitaker would likely be finishing his own evening routine, perhaps parking the truck, perhaps sitting down for supper in a place that felt ordinary and familiar. Otto realized that the young soldier probably had no idea how much those small visits had changed the atmosphere inside the camp. To Whitaker, it was simply a job. To the prisoners it had become something else entirely. A reminder that the world was larger and more complicated than the stories carried into war. As Otto stepped inside the barracks and the evening shadows settled across the yard, he understood that tomorrow morning might bring another ordinary delivery. Bread, coffee, perhaps something different. Yet whatever arrived on that truck would carry more than food. It would carry another quiet opportunity to see the world in a way that had once seemed impossible. The night settled quietly over the Mississippi camp, bringing with it a cooler breeze that moved softly through the pine trees beyond the fence. Inside the barracks the air was dim and calm, lit only by the faint glow of a single overhead bulb that hung above the center of the room. Otto Fisher lay on his narrow bunk, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling while the low sounds of other prisoners preparing for sleep filled the space around him. Boots scraped lightly across the floorboards. A few men spoke in quiet whispers. Someone near the far wall turned a page of a small notebook before closing it carefully. The day had been long, yet Otto felt more awake than usual. His thoughts continued circling back to the simple moments that had begun shaping his understanding of this unfamiliar place. Outside, the camp had grown almost silent now. The distant hum of insects rose steadily from the tall grass beyond the fence, blending with the occasional call of a night bird somewhere deeper in the trees. Otto shifted slightly on the thin mattress and rested his hands behind his head, letting the quiet settle around him. When he had first arrived in America, the nights had been the most difficult part of captivity. Darkness gave the mind too much time to wander, and his thoughts had often drifted toward uncertainty about the future. Yet tonight the feeling was different. Not hopeful exactly, but calmer. The world no longer felt like a closed door. Somewhere outside the barracks a guard walked along the gravel path, his footsteps steady and unhurried as he passed between the buildings. Otto listened to the rhythm of those steps for a moment before they faded toward the far end of the camp. The sound reminded him that life here followed a structure built from routine rather than fear. Every hour had its place, every task its purpose. The war still existed beyond the fences, but inside the camp there was a quiet order that slowly revealed itself day by day. A voice from the neighboring bunk interrupted his thoughts. Lucas Weber shifted onto his side and spoke softly into the dim light. "Are you still awake?" Otto turned his head slightly toward him. "Yes." Lucas was silent for a moment before continuing. "I have been thinking about something." Otto waited. Lucas let out a slow breath. "When the war ends, people will ask what this place was like." Otto considered the question carefully. He had imagined that moment many times before. Friends or family back home asking about captivity, expecting stories filled with bitterness and hardship. Yet now he realized the truth would be more complicated. Finally, he answered quietly, "I think I will tell them about the mornings." Lucas turned slightly, his face half visible in the soft glow of the overhead bulb. "The mornings." Otto nodded slowly, even though Lucas could barely see the movement. "Yes, the mornings with coffee and bread. The small things that reminded us we were still human." Lucas smiled faintly in the dim light before resting his head back on the thin pillow. "That is a good answer," he said quietly. For a while the barracks returned to silence again as the men settled into sleep. Otto remained awake a little longer, listening to the steady breathing around him. His thoughts drifted toward the road beyond the camp gates, the same narrow stretch of gravel that had become a symbol of the world waiting outside. Somewhere along that road Whitaker would likely be finishing his own evening, perhaps sitting at a kitchen table or resting after a long day of driving supplies across the countryside. The idea felt strangely comforting. Two men from opposite sides of a war moving through the same evening beneath the same sky. Otto closed his eyes slowly and allowed the quiet of the night to carry him toward sleep. Tomorrow morning the sun would rise again over the pine trees. The gravel yard would warm beneath the early light. and somewhere beyond the fence a truck might once again appear along the winding road. When it did, Otto knew the moment would not simply be about food or routine. It would be another quiet reminder that even in the middle of war, understanding could begin in the smallest and most ordinary ways. The next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm that had begun to define life inside the camp. The sky above Mississippi turned pale blue long before the sun fully cleared the pine trees, and a thin layer of mist hovered over the distant fields beyond the fence. Otto Fisher stepped out of the barracks and felt the cool air of early morning brush across his face. The temperature was just over 70 degrees, a welcome relief before the heat of the southern day would rise again. Around him the yard slowly came to life. Prisoners stretched their shoulders after sleep. Guards walked their familiar paths, and somewhere near the administration building the smell of coffee drifted into the open air. Otto paused near the wooden step outside the barracks and looked toward the road beyond the gate, the same narrow ribbon of gravel that curved gently through the trees before disappearing from view. For a moment nothing moved. Only the quiet sounds of morning filled the space. Birds called from the branches above the fence, and the wind carried the faint rustle of pine needles across the ground. Otto folded his arms and waited, not with expectation exactly, but with a calm curiosity that had slowly replaced the suspicion he once carried. Nearby, Lucas Weber stepped out beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes before glancing toward the road as well. Neither man spoke. They simply watched the horizon together. A few minutes later the sound arrived first. The distant rumble of an engine, steady and familiar. Otto recognized it immediately. The sound grew louder as the truck approached along the gravel road, its tires stirring a small cloud of dust behind it as it emerged between the tall trees and rolled toward the camp gate. When the vehicle passed beneath the guard post and entered the yard, the scene felt almost routine now. Whitaker stepped down from the cab just as he had the day before, stretching his arms briefly before walking to the back of the truck. The same metal containers rested inside the bed, stacked carefully beside a wooden crate. Otto watched quietly as the soldier lifted one container and carried it toward the long table near the fence. The movement was simple, ordinary, yet Otto realized something important in that moment. The power of those small gestures had never been about the food itself. It had been about the quiet message hidden within the routine. Whitaker set the container down and opened the lid, releasing a small wave of warm steam into the morning air. The smell of fresh bread drifted gently across the yard. Several prisoners stepped forward without hesitation now, forming a loose line near the table. Otto joined them slowly, feeling the gravel shift beneath his boots. When his turn arrived, Whitaker placed another warm bun into his hands along with a cup of coffee, just as he had before. Otto looked down at the bread for a moment, feeling the warmth spread through his palms. Then he looked up at the young soldier and nodded once in quiet thanks. Whitaker returned the nod without speaking. No long conversation followed. No dramatic moment interrupted the calm rhythm of the morning. Yet as Otto stepped aside and took his first bite of the bread, he realized that something inside him had changed in a way that would remain long after the war ended. He no longer saw the men beyond the fence as distant enemies defined by uniforms or language. He saw them as individuals moving through the same complicated world he inhabited. Men with routines, responsibilities, and ordinary habits that had nothing to do with hatred or propaganda. Otto stood beneath the brightening sky and finished the simple meal slowly while the camp awakened around him. The fences still stood. The watchtowers still cast long shadows across the gravel yard. Yet the invisible barrier that once separated two sides of a war had quietly begun to soften. And as the morning sun climbed higher above the pine trees, Otto understood something he would remember for the rest of his life. Wars are often remembered through battles and speeches, through maps and victories. But sometimes the moments that change people the most arrive in quieter forms. A cup of coffee shared at sunrise, a piece of warm bread placed into waiting hands, and the simple realization that even in the middle of conflict, humanity has a way of crossing the narrowest distance between two strangers.